Part 1. The Troublemaker's Reputation. There was this guy in London who thought he was going to be the next big internet star. Let's call him Dan. He was 28 years old, worked part-time at a gym, and spent most of his free time trying to get famous on social media. You know the type. Always walking around with his phone out, recording everything, looking for that one video that would blow up and change his life. Dan had been doing this for almost 3 years now. 3 whole years of making videos that barely got any attention. His channel had only about 3,000 followers, and most of them were probably his friends, family, and random bots. Meanwhile, he watched other people get millions of views doing silly pranks and challenges. It drove him crazy. Why wasn't he famous yet? He was trying so hard. The thing is, Dan's videos started off pretty harmless. In the beginning, he would film himself doing workout challenges, trying weird foods, or talking about his daily life. Basic stuff that nobody really cared about. But when those videos flopped, he decided he needed to do something different, something more extreme, something that would get people's attention. So he started doing pranks. Not the funny, light-hearted kind that makes everyone laugh. No, Dan's pranks were the annoying type, the kind that made people uncomfortable. He would go up to street performers and interrupt their shows. He would pretend to steal things from shops just to see how staff would react. He would walk up to security guards and get in their faces, trying to provoke them while his friend filmed everything. His friend, by the way, was always there encouraging him. This guy was just as desperate for fame as Dan was. He would stand behind the camera saying things like, "Come on, bro, do something crazy," or "That's not enough, they've seen that before." Together, they were like a terrible team, pushing each other to do worse and worse things. Dan's videos started getting a bit more attention, but not the good kind. People would comment things like, "Why are you bothering that person?" Or, "This isn't funny, you're just being rude." But Dan didn't care about those comments. He convinced himself that attention was attention. Even if people hated him, at least they were watching, right? At least they were talking about him. His parents didn't approve of what he was doing. His mom would tell him, "Get a real job. Stop wasting your time with this nonsense." His dad would shake his head and say, "You're embarrassing yourself." But Dan was stubborn. He believed he was just one viral video away from success. One big moment and everything would change. He would prove everyone wrong. The problem was Dan kept having to push further and further to get reactions. What shocked people last month didn't shock them anymore. The internet moves fast. People get bored quickly. So Dan had to keep thinking of new ways to be outrageous. It was like a drug. He needed bigger and bigger stunts to get that rush of views and comments. He had already been kicked out of several shopping centers. Security guards at popular tourist spots knew his face and would tell him to leave before he even started filming. Some restaurants had banned him after he pulled stupid pranks on their staff. His girlfriend had left him 6 months ago because she was tired of his obsession with going viral. She told him he was changing into someone she didn't recognize anymore. But Dan didn't listen. He thought she just didn't understand his vision. By this point, Dan was spending almost all his money on this dream. He bought better cameras, lighting equipment, and editing software. He paid for ads to promote his videos. He even bought fake followers once, thinking it would make his channel look more popular. Nothing worked the way he wanted. He was broke, stressed, and running out of ideas. That's when his friend came up with a suggestion that would change everything. They were sitting in Dan's tiny apartment, scrolling through social media, watching other people's successful videos. His friend suddenly sat up and said, "I've got it. The perfect video. Something nobody has done before." Dan looked up from his phone. What? The Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. Those guys who stand still like statues. We go there and mess with them. Really mess with them. Get right in their faces. Touch their guns. Grab their hats. Make them break character. Dan thought about it for a moment. He had seen videos of tourists taking pictures with the guards. Everyone knew about them. They were famous for standing completely still no matter what happened around them. People would make funny faces at them, dance around them, try everything to make them react. The guards almost never did. "I don't know, man," Dan said. "Those are actual soldiers. That seems like it could get us in trouble." His friend laughed. "That's exactly why it'll go viral. Nobody has the guts to really push it. We'll be the first." "Come on, what are they going to do? They can't touch tourists. They just stand there. That's their whole job." This was completely wrong, of course. The Queen's Guard are active military personnel with full authority to defend themselves and their post. But Dan didn't know that. Or maybe he didn't want to know. He was so desperate for that viral moment that he convinced himself it was fine. Think about it, his friend continued. Millions of people visit that palace. Millions of people know about those guards. If we do something wild there, something nobody's done before, it'll explode. Every news site will pick it up. We'll finally get the attention we deserve. That word, deserve, really stuck with Dan. He felt like he deserved to be famous. He had worked so hard, spent so much time and money. Surely he was owed some success, right? This could be it. This could be the moment everything changed. All right, Dan finally said. Let's do it. But we need to plan this out. We need to make sure we get good footage, multiple angles if possible. They spent the next few days planning their trip to Buckingham Palace. They looked at maps, figured out the best times to go when crowds would be biggest, and charged all their camera equipment. Dan felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Part of him knew this was probably a bad idea. But the bigger part of him, the part that was desperate and tired of failing, pushed those doubts away. He didn't research anything about the guards themselves. He didn't look up what would happen if someone actually assaulted them. He didn't think about consequences at all. In his mind, this was just another prank. Just another video. He would get his viral moment, finally become famous, and all his problems would be solved. Dan had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't know that in just a few days he would become famous, but not at all in the way he imagined. He was walking straight into a disaster, and he was too blind to see it coming. Sometimes the thing we want most is exactly what destroys us. Dan was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Part 2. A quiet day at the palace. Tommy stood perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace, wearing the famous red uniform and tall black bearskin hat that tourists loved to photograph. To anyone looking at him, he was just a statue, a piece of living history standing guard. But behind that blank expression and unmoving posture was a real person with a real story. Tommy was 25 years old and had been in the British Army for 7 years. This wasn't some ceremonial job where you just stood around looking pretty. No, Tommy was a proper soldier. Before getting this posting at the palace, he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He had seen real combat. He had been in situations where one wrong move could cost lives. He had earned the respect of his fellow soldiers through years of hard work and dedication. Getting selected to serve as one of the Queen's Guard was actually a huge honor. Not every soldier got this opportunity. You had to have an excellent service record. You had to be disciplined, reliable, and trustworthy. The guards at Buckingham Palace represent centuries of British military tradition. They're not actors or models hired to stand there. They're active duty soldiers doing an important job. Tommy's typical day started early, around 5 in the morning. He would wake up in the barracks, have breakfast with his unit, and then begin the careful process of getting into uniform. The red tunic had to be perfect, not a single wrinkle. The bearskin hat weighed about 1.5 pounds and took some getting used to. His boots were polished until they shined like mirrors. His rifle was inspected to make sure it was in perfect condition. Everything had to be exact. By the time Tommy took his position outside the palace, he had already been awake for hours. His shift would last for 2 hours of standing. Then he would get a break, then another 2 hours. It sounds easy standing still, but try doing it sometime. Try standing in one spot, not moving, for 2 full hours. Your legs start to ache. Your back gets stiff. In summer, the heavy uniform makes you sweat. In winter, the cold seeps into your bones, and through it all, you have to maintain that perfect, emotionless expression. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort, though. It was dealing with the tourists. Tommy had learned to develop a kind of mental shield. He would fix his eyes on a point in the distance and let his peripheral vision handle everything else. This way, he could stay aware of his surroundings while maintaining that statue-like appearance everyone expected. Most tourists were respectful. They would take their photos from a polite distance, maybe wave or smile, and move on. Tommy didn't mind those people at all. They were just excited to see something famous, something uniquely British. He understood that. Some would even thank him for his service, which he appreciated even though he couldn't respond. But then, there were the others. The ones who thought the guards were just props, toys for their entertainment. These people would get right up in Tommy's face, trying to make him laugh or react. They would make silly noises, pull funny faces, dance around like idiots. Some would even try to touch him or his uniform. He had lost count of how many times someone tried to grab his hat or poke him to see if he was real. Tommy had been trained for all of this. During his preparation for palace duty, Instructors taught the guards how to handle difficult situations. The first rule was always to ignore minor annoyances. People being silly or taking photos was just part of the job. You stand still, you stay professional. You represent your country and your regiment. But there were limits. If someone crossed a line, if they touched your weapon or got physically aggressive, the guards had authority to respond. They could shout a warning, which usually scared people enough to back off. In extreme cases, they could take action to defend themselves or their post. The Metropolitan Police, who also patrol the palace grounds, were always nearby to handle situations that got out of control. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, everything seemed normal. It was a beautiful day, sunny and warm, so the crowds were bigger than usual. Families with children, elderly couples, tour groups from all over the world. They moved around the palace gates in waves, everyone wanting their picture with the famous guards. Tommy had been at his post for about an hour. His legs were starting to feel the familiar ache, but he was used to it. He watched the crowd without really seeing them, his mind partly somewhere else. He thought about his girlfriend back home, wondered what she was doing. He thought about the football match he wanted to watch that evening. He thought about his upcoming leave when he could finally take a proper holiday. Behind that expressionless face, Tommy was just a regular guy with regular thoughts. He missed his family. He worried about his future. He had dreams and hopes and fears like anyone else. But when he wore this uniform, when he stood at this post, none of that could show. He was a symbol, a tradition, a guardian of one of the world's most famous buildings. The afternoon sun was warm on his face. Tommy could hear children laughing, tour guides explaining the history of the palace in different languages, the constant click and buzz of cameras and phones. Somewhere in the background, a street musician was playing classical music on a violin. It was actually quite peaceful in its own way. Tommy had learned something important during his time as a guard. This job taught you patience. It taught you discipline. It taught you that you could endure discomfort and boredom while maintaining your standards. These weren't just ceremonial lessons. These were qualities that made you a better soldier, a better person. Every day standing at this post was training, even if it didn't look like it. He had about an hour left in this shift. Then he could take a break, sit down, have some water, and rest his feet. His replacement would take over, and Tommy would head back to the barracks. Later, he would change out of this heavy uniform, put on normal clothes, and just be himself for a while. But right now, in this moment, Tommy was the Queen's Guard. He stood tall and straight, rifle at his side, eyes forward, expression blank. The weight of tradition rested on his shoulders along with that heavy bearskin hat. He was one guard in a long line of guards stretching back through history. Men who had stood at this same post during wars and peace, through rain and sun, through calm days and dangerous ones. Tommy noticed a guy approaching with a phone held up, recording. Nothing unusual about that. Dozens of people had filmed him already today. He maintained his position, eyes fixed forward, and prepared to ignore whatever silly thing this tourist was about to do. He had no idea that this particular tourist was going to be different. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, his training, his reflexes, and his experience as a combat soldier would all be put to the test. He had no idea that this quiet Tuesday afternoon was about to become a day he would never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous moments come when you least expect them. Tommy was about to face a situation that would test everything he had learned in 7 years of military service. And he was about to show the world that the Queen's Guard are not just statues standing there for decoration. They're real soldiers, always ready, always alert, always prepared to do their duty. Part 3. The Confrontation. Begins. Dan walked up to Tommy with his phone camera already recording. His friend was a few feet behind him, also filming from a different angle. They wanted to make sure they got this from every direction. This was going to be their big moment, or so Dan thought. At first, Dan started with the typical stuff that most annoying tourists do. He stood really close to Tommy and made exaggerated faces at the camera. He waved his hands around in front of Tommy's face, trying to block his view. He did a little dance, making stupid noises and acting like a complete fool. The whole time he was talking to his camera, saying things like, "Look at this, he won't even blink. This is crazy. Let's see if we can make him react." Tommy remained perfectly still. His training kicked in automatically. This was just another annoying tourist, nothing he hadn't dealt with 100 times before. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his expression blank. He could see Dan in his peripheral vision, but he gave no indication that he was even aware of his presence. This was part of the job. Stay professional, stay calm. Ignore the nonsense, but Dan was getting frustrated. This wasn't giving him the content he wanted. He needed something bigger, something more dramatic. His friend was making hand gestures from behind the camera, encouraging him to push further. Dan could see other tourists starting to gather around watching what he was doing. Some were taking out their own phones to record. This was exactly what he wanted, an audience. Now he just needed to give them a show. Come on, mate, Dan said loudly, getting even closer to Tommy's face. Don't you ever smile? What's wrong with you? Are you even real? He reached out and poked Tommy's shoulder. Nothing. No reaction at all. This was actually starting to annoy Dan. How could someone just stand there and take this? It was like the guard was mocking him by not responding. The crowd around them was growing. Some people looked uncomfortable with what Dan was doing. A few parents pulled their children away, sensing that this wasn't appropriate behavior, but others were entertained, laughing at Dan's antics. This mixed reaction only encouraged Dan more. He was getting attention. Finally, people were watching him. Tommy's mind was working quickly behind that blank expression. This guy was pushing boundaries, but he hadn't crossed the line yet. Annoying? Yes. Disrespectful? Absolutely. But not quite at the level where Tommy needed to respond. He maintained his position and continued to monitor the situation. He was aware of exactly where Dan was, where his friend was, where the other tourists were positioned. His military training never switched off. Then Dan decided to escalate things further. He reached out and tapped Tommy's rifle. Just a quick tap at first, testing to see what would happen. Still no reaction from Tommy. So Dan did it again, this time letting his hand rest on the weapon for a moment longer. He was grinning at his camera now, thinking he was being so clever, so bold. Look at him touching a Queen's Guard's rifle. This was definitely going to get views. This was the first serious mistake. Touching a soldier's weapon is never okay. It doesn't matter if you're joking or making a video. That rifle isn't a prop. It's a real weapon, and interfering with it is a serious offense. Tommy felt a spike of alertness. This tourist was crossing into dangerous territory. But still, he maintained his position. He would give one warning if things got worse. Dan's friend was shouting encouragement from behind his camera. Yes, that's it. Do more, touch his hat. This is brilliant. The crowd was getting larger now, forming a semicircle around the scene. Some people were gasping, others were laughing nervously. A few were shaking their heads, clearly disapproving of what they were watching. Emboldened by the attention and his friend's encouragement, Dan reached up toward Tommy's bearskin hat. This hat is part of the official uniform, a symbol of the regiment. It's treated with respect by everyone in the military. Dan's fingers brushed against it, and he actually tried to lift it slightly as if he might pull it off Tommy's head. That was it. That was the line. In one explosive movement, Tommy stamped his right foot down hard on the pavement. The sound was like a gunshot echoing off the palace walls. At the same time, he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." His voice was absolutely thunderous. It wasn't a normal speaking voice. It was a parade ground voice, a voice trained to carry across battlefields, a voice that commanded immediate obedience. The power and authority in that shout made everyone jump. Several tourists screamed. Children started crying. The crowd instantly took several steps backward. Dan nearly dropped his phone. His heart was hammering in his chest. For a second, he had forgotten that this wasn't just a statue or an actor. This was a real soldier, and that soldier had just demonstrated exactly how much power and authority he held. The sound of that stomp and that shout had actually scared Dan more than he wanted to admit. But here's the thing about people like Dan. When they get scared or embarrassed, they often react by getting aggressive. They don't want to admit they were wrong or that they're afraid, so instead of backing off like any sensible person would have done, Dan did something incredibly stupid. He laughed. It was a nervous laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they're trying to convince themselves and others that they're not bothered by something. Dan looked at his friend's camera, then at the crowd, then back at Tommy. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. He had two choices. He could walk away, admit this was a bad idea and leave with at least some dignity. Or he could double down, prove he wasn't scared, and give his viewers the extreme content he had promised. Dan chose wrong. "Oh, scary," he said mockingly, his voice trying to sound brave even though his hands were shaking slightly. The toy soldier shouted at me. What's next? You gonna tell me to stand in the corner? His friend laughed from behind the camera. Don't back down now, bro. You've got this. He can't do anything. This was completely false, of course. Tommy could do quite a lot if Dan continued to threaten him or interfere with his duties. But Dan didn't know that. Or maybe he knew it somewhere in the back of his mind but was too caught up in his own ego to care. Tommy had returned to his still position, but now he was on high alert. This wasn't just an annoying tourist anymore. This was a potential threat. His eyes remained fixed forward, but every sense was focused on Dan. He could hear the guy's breathing, could sense his movements, could feel the aggressive energy radiating from him. Tommy's body was relaxed but ready, like a coiled spring. The crowd had gone quiet now. The laughter had stopped. People could sense that something was about to happen. Some of the smarter tourists were already backing away, getting their families to safety. Others stayed, their phones up, recording everything. Nobody knew exactly what was about to happen, but everyone could feel the tension in the air. Dan moved closer again. He was now standing directly in front of Tommy, just inches away from his face. He could probably feel Tommy's breath. This was an intimidation tactic, the kind of thing bullies do when they want to make someone uncomfortable. Dan was tall and muscular, used to using his size to push people around. He thought he could intimidate this guard into breaking character, into showing some kind of reaction. What are you going to do? Dan said quietly, his face so close to Tommy's that only the guard could hear him clearly. Huh? You just stand here all day like an idiot. You can't touch me. You can't move. You're nothing. Tommy's expression didn't change. His breathing remained steady. But inside he was making calculations, preparing for what he suspected was coming next. 7 years of military service had given him excellent instincts about people and situations. And right now, every instinct was telling him that this guy was about to do something really, really stupid. Part 4. The Fatal Mistake. There's a moment in every disaster when everything could still be okay. One moment where a person can make the right choice and walk away. Dan stood at that exact moment, inches from Tommy's face, with a choice to make. Every cell in his body should have been screaming at him to step back, to apologize, to leave while he still could. But Dan's ego was bigger than his common sense. What are you going to do about it, toy soldier? Dan said loudly, making sure his words would be picked up by the cameras. He wanted this on film. He wanted everyone to hear him standing up to the guard. In his twisted logic, this was the moment that would make him famous. This was his viral content goldmine. Tommy remained motionless, but his training had kicked into full gear. He had assessed Dan as a threat. His peripheral vision tracked Dan's hands, his shoulders, his weight distribution. Tommy had been in combat situations where reading body language could mean the difference between life and death. And right now, Dan's body language was screaming aggression. The crowd around them had gone completely silent. Even Dan's friend had stopped shouting encouragement. People were holding their breath, phones raised, recording. Some of the tourists who understood the seriousness of the situation had already moved far back. Parents covered their children's eyes. An elderly woman actually said out loud, "Someone should stop this before he gets hurt." But nobody stopped it. Everyone just watched. Dan pulled his arm back. Time seemed to slow down. Tommy saw it happening in his peripheral vision, the telltale movement of someone preparing to throw a punch. The slight rotation of Dan's shoulders, the shift in his weight to his back foot, the cocking back of his fist. Tommy had seen this movement 1,000 times in training. He knew exactly what was coming. Dan threw the punch. It was aimed at Tommy's jaw, a full power swing meant to hurt. Dan had put all his frustration, all his desperate need for attention, all his anger into that one punch. His fist cut through the air toward Tommy's face. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. Dan's friend shouted, "Oh my God!" The punch never landed. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but it was the most impressive 2 seconds most of those tourists had ever witnessed. Tommy moved with a speed and precision that shocked everyone who was watching. This wasn't the slow ceremonial guard anymore. This was a combat-trained soldier responding to a threat. Tommy's left arm came up and deflected Dan's punch to the side. The movement was so smooth, so efficient that it looked almost easy. But it wasn't easy. It was years of training compressed into one perfect defensive motion. Dan's fist sailed past Tommy's face, hitting nothing but air. At the exact same moment, Tommy delivered a palm strike to Dan's chest. Not a punch, a palm strike. This is important. Tommy used precisely the amount of force needed to stop the threat, without causing serious injury. This wasn't about revenge or anger. This was about neutralizing a situation professionally and efficiently. The impact of Tommy's palm against Dan's chest was solid and powerful. Dan's eyes went wide with shock. All the air rushed out of his lungs in one big whoosh. His legs suddenly didn't want to work properly. He stumbled backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to keep his balance. For a moment he looked like a cartoon character, feet scrambling to find stable ground. Then Dan fell. Hard. He landed on his backside on the pavement, his phone clattering out of his hand and skidding across the ground. It kept recording from its new position on the sidewalk, capturing Dan sitting on the ground, gasping for breath, looking absolutely stunned. The crowd erupted. Some people applauded. Others gasped or covered their mouths in shock. Children asked their parents what had just happened. Dozens of phones captured every angle of Dan sitting on the ground, completely defeated by one move from the guard he had mocked as a toy soldier. Tommy had already returned to his position. His face was expressionless again. His breathing was steady. He stood there as if absolutely nothing had happened. The rifle was back at his side, his eyes were fixed forward, his posture was perfect. To look at him, you would never know that just seconds ago he had defended himself against an attack. He looked exactly the same as he had before Dan had approached him. But while Tommy looked calm, a lot was happening that Dan couldn't see. The moment Tommy had been forced to defend himself, protocols kicked into action. 2 Metropolitan Police officers who patrol Buckingham Palace had been nearby and had witnessed the entire confrontation. They were already moving toward Dan, their radios crackling with communication to their command center. Dan was still sitting on the ground, trying to breathe normally. His chest hurt where Tommy had struck him. He felt like he couldn't get enough air. His hands were shaking. Reality was starting to crash down on him like a wave. What had he just done? Did he really just attack a soldier? At Buckingham Palace? With hundreds of people watching and recording? His friend ran up to him, still holding his camera. Dude, did you see that? Did you get it on film? That was insane. We're going to be so famous. But Dan wasn't listening. He was watching the 2 police officers approaching with very serious expressions on their faces. Behind them, 2 more officers were coming from another direction. This wasn't good. This wasn't good at all. "Sir, stay where you are," one of the officers commanded. His voice was firm and authoritative. This wasn't a request. This was an order. Dan tried to stand up, but his legs were still shaky. "Look, officer, I was just making a video. It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." The officer wasn't interested in excuses. "Sir, we witnessed you assault a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. You need to remain where you are and place your hands where I can see them." The word assault hit Dan like a punch to the gut. Assault? No, that wasn't right. This was just a prank. Just a video. Just entertainment. He looked around at the crowd, seeing all those phones pointed at him, all those faces watching. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the hero of this story, the guy who wasn't afraid to push boundaries. Instead, he was sitting on the ground while police officers moved in to arrest him. "This is ridiculous," Dan's friend shouted at the officers. "He barely touched him, and the guard hit him. Shouldn't you be arresting the guard?" The second officer turned to Dan's friend with a look that could freeze water. "Sir, I suggest you be quiet and hand over that camera. That footage is evidence, and if you continue to interfere, you'll be joining your friend in handcuffs." Dan's friend went pale and took a step back. The reality of the situation was hitting him too. This wasn't a game. This wasn't content creation. This was real legal trouble, and they were both in the middle of it. The first officer moved behind Dan. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back." "Wait, what? You're arresting me. For what?" "For assault on a serviceman. Conduct likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress and interfering with a member of the military in the course of their duties." "You have the right to remain silent." Dan felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists. The officer continued reading him his rights, but Dan wasn't really hearing the words anymore. Everything sounded distant and muffled, like he was underwater. This couldn't be happening. This was supposed to be his big break. His viral moment. His chance at fame. The crowd watched as Dan was lifted to his feet by the officers. His face was red with embarrassment and shock. Some people in the crowd were actually clapping. Clapping. They were happy he was being arrested. He heard someone say, "Serves him right." "You don't mess with the Queen's Guard." As the officers led Dan away, he caught one last glimpse of Tommy. The guard stood at his post, tall and straight, looking exactly as he had before any of this started. It was like nothing had happened at all. Like Dan was so insignificant that dealing with him didn't even require a change in expression. That's when it truly hit Dan. He wasn't going to be famous for being brave or bold or entertaining. He was going to be famous for being an idiot. For attacking a soldier, for getting instantly defeated and arrested in front of hundreds of people. His viral moment had arrived, but not in any way he had imagined. Dan's phone was still lying on the ground, its camera pointing up at the sky, still recording. An officer picked it up and placed it in an evidence bag. That phone contained the complete footage of Dan's stupidity from his own perspective. It would be used against him in court. As Dan was led away toward a police van, he could hear the crowd behind him. Some were laughing. Others were discussing what they had just witnessed. Tour guides were already incorporating this story into their palace tours. And just moments ago, right here, a man attacked one of the guards and was immediately arrested. Please, everyone, respect the guards. They are real soldiers doing an important job. The last thing Dan saw before getting into the police van was Buckingham Palace, standing magnificent and unmovable, just like the guard he had foolishly attacked. The palace had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. Kings and queens had lived there. History had happened there. And now, Dan's biggest moment of stupidity had happened there too, recorded from a dozen angles, ready to be shared with the entire world. Part 5. Reality Sets. In the inside of the police van smelled like disinfectant and stress. Dan sat on the hard metal bench, hands cuffed behind his back, staring at the floor. His friend had been let go with a warning after handing over his camera footage, but Dan wasn't so lucky. He was alone now, really alone, and everything was starting to sink in. The van drove through London streets, and with every turn, Dan's mind raced faster. What had he done? What was going to happen to him? He tried to replay the events in his head, but it all seemed like a blur. One moment he was standing there making his video, feeling confident, and the next moment he was on the ground in handcuffs. How did it go wrong so fast? His chest still hurt from where Tommy had hit him. Every breath reminded him of his mistake. Dan had thought the guard wouldn't fight back, that they weren't allowed to. He had been so wrong. That single defensive move had been so quick, so precise, so powerful. Dan worked out at the gym 5 days a week. He considered himself strong. But that guard had handled him like he was nothing. The police station was busy when they arrived. Officers walking back and forth, phones ringing, people being processed. Dan was led through the building past holding cells where he could hear other people shouting or crying. The reality of where he was hit him hard. This was a real police station. He was really under arrest. This wasn't a movie or a prank video. This was his actual life falling apart. They took him to a processing room. The officer removed his handcuffs and told him to empty his pockets. Dan placed his wallet, keys, and some coins on the counter. Everything was cataloged and put into a clear plastic bag. They took his photo from the front and from the side. Mugshots. He was getting mugshots taken. Dan had never even had a parking ticket before, and now he was being photographed like a criminal. "Phone," the officer said, holding out his hand. "My phone fell at the palace," Dan replied quietly. "It got taken as evidence," the officer made a note. "That phone's automatic cloud backup probably uploaded everything while you were recording. We'll be accessing that footage. Your password, please." Dan gave them his password. What choice did he have? They were going to get into his phone anyway. And if they saw that footage, they would see everything. They would see him approaching the guard, harassing him, touching his weapon, grabbing at his hat, and finally throwing that punch. It was all there, recorded from his own perspective, showing exactly what he did. They led him to a small interview room and told him to sit. The room was cold and bare, with just a table and 3 chairs. There was a camera in the corner, a red light blinking, recording everything. Dan sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. 20 minutes alone with his thoughts, and none of those thoughts were good. He thought about his mom. What would she say when she found out? She had warned him to stop making these stupid videos. She had told him he was heading for trouble. And he had ignored her, thinking he knew better. Now he would have to call her from a police station. How do you even have that conversation? He thought about his ex-girlfriend. She had left him because of his obsession with getting famous online. She had told him he was changing, becoming someone she didn't recognize. He had been angry at her for not supporting his dreams. But sitting here now, Dan realized she had been right. He had changed. He had become so desperate for attention that he lost all common sense. The door opened and 2 officers came in. One was older, probably in his 50s with gray hair and a tired expression. The other was younger, maybe early 30s, carrying a laptop. They sat down across from Dan. "I'm Detective Inspector Harris," the older officer said. "This is Detective Constable Brown. We're going to talk about what happened today at Buckingham Palace. Do you understand why you're here?" Dan nodded. "I think so. You think so?" Detective Harris raised an eyebrow. "Let me be very clear. You're here because you assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while they were performing their duty. This is a serious offense. Do you understand that?" "It was just a prank," Dan said weakly. Even as the words left his mouth, he knew how stupid they sounded. Detective Brown opened his laptop and turned it to face Dan. On the screen was a video, paused at the moment Dan's fist was pulled back, about to throw the punch. "This doesn't look like a prank to me. This looks like assault. We have this from multiple angles. We have your own footage from your phone. We have witness statements from dozens of tourists. The evidence is overwhelming." Dan stared at the screen. Seeing it from this angle made it look even worse. You could see the aggression on his face, the deliberate wind-up of the punch. There was no way to claim this was an accident or a misunderstanding. "I didn't think he would hit me back," Dan mumbled. "He didn't hit you back," Detective Harris said firmly. "He defended himself using appropriate force. That guard showed remarkable restraint. He could have done much more damage to you, but he used only enough force to stop your attack. You should be grateful for his professionalism." The interview continued for over an hour. They asked Dan about his social media accounts, his previous videos, his motivation for going to the palace. They had already reviewed his channel and found videos of him harassing other people, causing disturbances, deliberately provoking reactions. It all looked terrible now, seeing it through the eyes of the law rather than through the lens of entertainment. "You have a pattern of this behavior," Detective Brown said. "This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. You've been escalating for months, harassing street performers, bothering shop staff, provoking security guards, and today you finally crossed a line you can't uncross." Dan didn't know what to say. Everything they were saying was true. He had been escalating. Each video had to be more extreme than the last to get attention. He had been chasing views and likes without thinking about the real people he was affecting. Without thinking about consequences. "What's going to happen to me?" Dan finally asked. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair. "You'll be formally charged and have to appear in court. Given the severity of the offense and the clear evidence, you'll likely be looking at a criminal conviction. The exact sentence will be up to the magistrate, but assaulting a serviceman is taken very seriously in this country." Dan felt sick. A criminal conviction. That would follow him for the rest of his life. Background checks, job applications, everything. His whole future was being destroyed because of one stupid video. After the interview, Dan was allowed one phone call. His hands were shaking as he dialed his mom's number. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom, it's me. Dan, why are you calling from a strange number? Is everything okay?" "Mom, I'm at a police station. I need help." There was a long silence. Then his mom's voice came back, tight with worry and disappointment. "What did you do?" Dan tried to explain, but he broke down halfway through. He started crying, really crying, for the first time since this whole thing began. All the fear and regret and shame came pouring out. His mom listened quietly, and when he finished, she simply said, "I'll be there as soon as I can." They put Dan in a cell while they waited for his mom to arrive and arrange for a solicitor. The cell was small and cold, with just a bench and a toilet. Dan sat on the bench and put his head in his hands. Through the small window in the door, he could hear other people in other cells. Someone was singing drunkenly. Someone else was shouting at the officers. And Dan just sat there in silence, thinking about how spectacularly he had ruined his life. Hours later, his mom arrived with a solicitor. Dan had never been so relieved and so ashamed to see her. She looked older than he remembered, worry lines deep on her face. She hugged him and he started crying again. "We'll figure this out," she said quietly. "But Dan, when this is over, you and I need to have a very serious talk about your life choices." The solicitor explained the situation. Dan would be released on bail but would have to appear in court in 2 weeks. He was forbidden from going anywhere near Buckingham Palace or any other royal property. He had to surrender his passport. And he needed to stay out of trouble because any further incidents would make everything much worse. When Dan finally walked out of the police station, it was dark outside. He had been there for almost 8 hours. His mom drove him home in silence. Dan stared out the window at the London streets, at the normal people going about their normal lives. Just this morning, he had been one of them. Now, everything had changed. Back at his apartment, Dan immediately checked his phone's cloud backup on his laptop. His heart sank. While he had been in custody, the video had automatically uploaded, and somehow it had already leaked online. Someone, somewhere, had gotten access to it or had been recording their own version. The video was spreading. Within hours of his arrest, multiple videos of the incident were already going viral. Dan watched in horror as the view counts climbed. 10,000 views. 100,000. 500,000. He was getting his viral moment just like he wanted. But instead of making him famous, it was making him infamous. The comment section was brutal. People were calling him an idiot, a disgrace, a bully. Nobody was on his side. Nobody thought what he did was funny or brave or entertaining. Dan had wanted the world to see him. Now the world was seeing him and they hated what they saw. He had become famous overnight. Part 6. The aftermath. Dan woke up the next morning hoping it had all been a terrible dream. But the ache in his chest where Tommy had struck him was very real. The bail paperwork on his kitchen table was very real, and when he picked up his phone, the nightmare got even worse. Overnight, the story had exploded across the internet. It wasn't just on social media anymore. News websites were covering it. British tabloids had made it their front page story. International news outlets were picking it up. Dan's face was everywhere and none of it was good. The Daily Mail's headline read, "Palace pranksters royal fail, bully attacks guard and gets instant justice." The article included multiple videos of the incident from different angles, photos of Dan being led away in handcuffs and even screenshots from his social media showing his previous harassment videos. They had done their research. The Sun went with, "Guard duty, soldier stops attacker in seconds." Their article praised Tommy's professional response and included quotes from military experts explaining the training guards receive. Even the BBC covered it, treating it as a serious story about respecting military personnel and the consequences of assault. They interviewed a former Queen's Guard who explained that the guards are not just ceremonial, they're active duty soldiers who deserve respect. But the tabloids were gentle compared to social media. Dan made the mistake of checking Twitter. His name was trending. Actually trending. This is what he had always wanted, to trend on social media. But not like this. Never like this. The tweets were savage. People were tearing him apart. Someone had created a compilation video titled, "Idiot Attacks Royal Guard and Gets Destroyed," that had been viewed over 10 million times in 12 hours. 10 million people had watched him get humiliated. "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes," one tweet said, with thousands of likes. "Imagine being so desperate for attention that you assault a soldier." "Pathetic," said another. "That guard showed incredible restraint." "I would have done much worse," read a popular comment with tens of thousands of retweets. There were memes too. Someone had made a before and after image. The before showed Dan looking cocky and confident as he approached the guard. The after showed him on the ground, looking shocked and defeated. The caption read, "When you forget the Queen's Guard are actual soldiers." Another meme used a famous format, showing Dan saying, "I'm about to end this guard's whole career," in one panel, followed by him sitting on the ground in handcuffs with the caption, "Narrator, he did not." Dan wanted to respond, to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't as bad as it looked, but his solicitor had been very clear. Do not engage with social media. Do not comment on the case. Do not try to explain or apologize publicly. Anything he said could be used against him in court. So Dan had to just sit there and watch as the entire world mocked him. He couldn't fight back. He couldn't defend himself. He could only watch as his reputation was destroyed in real time. His personal social media accounts were getting flooded too. His Instagram, which had about 3,000 followers before, now had people leaving angry comments on every post he had ever made. His Facebook was the same. Even his LinkedIn, which he barely used, was getting messages from people calling him unprofessional and unemployable. Then his phone started ringing. The first call was from his gym. They had seen the videos. Due to the negative publicity and the nature of the incident, they were terminating his part-time employment immediately. They couldn't have someone associated with assaulting military personnel representing their business. The second call was from his landlord. Other tenants in the building had recognized Dan from the news and were complaining. The landlord couldn't evict him over this, but he made it very clear that Dan was not welcome and should consider finding somewhere else to live. The third call was from his best friend from school, someone he had known for 15 years. "I saw the videos, mate. I can't believe you did that. My wife doesn't want our kids around you anymore. I think we need some space." Then he hung up. That one hurt more than the others, losing a 15-year friendship in a 30-second phone call. But Dan understood. Who would want to be associated with him now? He had become toxic. Anyone connected to him would get dragged into the negative attention. Dan's mom called next. She had been fielding calls from relatives and neighbors all morning. Everyone had seen the news. Everyone was asking questions. She sounded exhausted and heartbroken. "Dan, your aunt is saying we're not welcome at the family reunion next month. Your cousin doesn't want you near his children. This is affecting the whole family." "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," she said, her voice breaking. "I raised you better than this." Where did I go wrong? That question haunted Dan for the rest of the day. Where did it go wrong? When did he become the kind of person who would assault a soldier for internet views? He tried to trace it back, to find the moment where he crossed the line from wanting success to being willing to do anything for attention. But it wasn't one moment. It was 1,000 small choices, each one taking him further down the wrong path. By afternoon, the story had gone international. American news sites were covering it. Australian morning shows were discussing it. Someone in Japan had made an anime-style animation of the incident that was getting millions of views. Dan had achieved what he always dreamed of: global recognition. But instead of being celebrated, he was being used as an example of what not to do. A cybersecurity expert on a news program said, "This is a perfect example of how the desperate pursuit of viral fame can destroy your life. This young man will never escape this video. It will follow him forever." A child psychologist on another show said, "We need to teach young people that likes and views are not worth sacrificing your dignity, your future, or your freedom." This incident should be a wake-up call. Even comedy shows were getting in on it. A late-night host did a whole segment about it, showing the video and making jokes. "Here's a life tip," the host said. "If someone is called a guard, they're probably guarding something. And if they're wearing a military uniform, they're probably military. Maybe don't punch them." The audience laughed. Millions of people laughed. At Dan. He was a punchline now. His old school friends created a group chat without him to discuss the situation. Someone accidentally added Dan to it before realizing and removing him, but not before he saw several messages. "Can't believe he did that." "Always knew he was desperate for attention." "Glad we're not close anymore." "Hope they throw the book at him." These were people he had grown up with, people he considered friends, and they were celebrating his downfall. The worst part was seeing how the video was being used. Parents were showing it to their teenagers as an example of why chasing internet fame is dangerous. Teachers were using it in lessons about digital citizenship and consequences. Police departments were sharing it as an example of what constitutes assault. Dan had become an educational tool, a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you take things too far. 3 days after the incident, someone found Dan's old social media posts from years ago. Things he had said when he was younger and even more stupid. Controversial opinions, offensive jokes, insensitive comments. All of it was being dug up and shared. This is what happens when the internet turns against you. They don't just focus on your current mistake. They excavate your entire past looking for more reasons to condemn you. Dan stopped leaving his apartment. Photographers had found out where he lived and were waiting outside, hoping to get a photo of him looking miserable. Journalists left business cards under his door, asking for exclusive interviews. His story was valuable now, but not in the way he had wanted. His social media follower count, which he had obsessed over for 3 years, had actually gone up. He now had 50,000 followers, but they weren't fans. They were people who followed him to mock him, to see what he would do next, to watch his downfall in real time. Someone had created a subreddit dedicated to documenting every aspect of the story. They had found his old videos, analyzed his social media history, and even contacted people who knew him for comments. A week after the incident, Dan received an email from YouTube. His channel had been demonetized due to violating community guidelines. All his previous videos that showed him harassing people were being removed. The platform didn't want to be associated with him anymore. His Instagram account was reported so many times that it got temporarily suspended. His TikTok account, which he rarely used, was permanently banned. The very platforms he had tried so desperately to succeed on were now shutting him out. But the internet never forgets. Even though his official accounts were being taken down, the videos of his attack on Tommy lived on. They were mirrored on hundreds of websites, shared millions of times, embedded in articles, discussed in forums. That moment of stupidity would exist forever in the digital world. Dan tried to find support online, looking for people who might understand or sympathize. He found a few comments from people saying the punishment didn't fit the crime, that everyone makes mistakes. But these were drowned out by thousands of comments calling him an idiot who deserved everything he got. One particularly popular comment summed up the public mood. He spent years trying to go viral. He finally did. Congratulations. Part 7. Legal Consequences. 2 weeks after the incident, Dan stood outside Westminster Magistrates Court with his mom and his solicitor. The building looked imposing and official, all stone columns and serious architecture. Photographers were waiting at the entrance, cameras ready. The moment they spotted Dan, the clicking started. Flash after flash, dozens of cameras capturing his face as he walked up the steps. "Don't look at them," his solicitor advised quietly. "Keep your head forward and walk normally." But it was hard to ignore. The photographers were shouting his name, trying to get him to look their way for a better shot. Reporters were calling out questions. "Do you regret what you did? Are you going to apologize? What do you say to people who think you're a disgrace?" Dan said nothing. His solicitor had been very clear about that. Don't speak to the press. Don't react. Just get inside the building and let the legal process happen. Inside the courthouse, everything felt very formal and serious. Security checks, metal detectors, people in professional clothing walking purposefully through the halls. Dan's hands were sweating. He had never been in a courtroom before. He had no idea what to expect. His solicitor, an experienced man named Mr. Peterson, had prepared him as well as possible. "The prosecution has overwhelming evidence," he had explained during their preparation meeting. "Multiple videos from multiple angles, witness statements, your own recorded footage. We can't dispute what happened. Our strategy is to show remorse, explain the circumstances, and hope for leniency." But it wasn't that serious, Dan had protested weakly. "I just pushed him a bit." Mr. Peterson had looked at him seriously. "You threw a punch at a serving member of the armed forces while they were on duty. In British law, that's very serious." The guard showed remarkable restraint in defending himself. If he had wanted to, he could have done much more damage. "You're lucky he's a professional." Now, sitting in the courtroom waiting for his case to be called, Dan felt the full weight of his situation. This was real. This wasn't going to go away. Whatever happened in the next few hours would affect the rest of his life. The courtroom was smaller than he expected, but every bit as intimidating. Dark wood paneling, formal seating, the coat of arms on the wall. The magistrate sat elevated at the front, looking down at everyone else. Dan felt very small. "All rise," the clerk announced, and everyone stood as the magistrate entered. District Judge Margaret Williams was in her 60s, with gray hair and an expression that suggested she had seen every type of criminal case imaginable, and wasn't impressed by any of them. She sat down and adjusted her glasses, looking at the papers in front of her. "Case of the Crown versus Daniel Robert Harrison," the clerk announced. Dan's heart was pounding. Hearing his full name read out in court made everything feel more real. The prosecutor stood up, a sharp woman in her 40s named Ms. Chen. She presented the case methodically and clearly. She showed the videos on screen set up in the courtroom. Watching them again in this official setting made Dan want to disappear. The footage looked even worse on a big screen with everyone watching in silence. Ms. Chen walked through the timeline of events. Dan approaching the guard. The initial harassment. The escalation. The touching of military equipment. The grabbing at the guard's hat. The warning stamp and shout. Dan's decision to continue anyway. And finally the attack. "Your Honor," Ms. Chen said. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. The defendant had multiple opportunities to walk away. The guard gave him a clear warning. Anyone with common sense would have stopped, but the defendant chose to escalate the situation. He chose to throw a punch at a serving soldier. This attack was captured on video from multiple angles, including the defendant's own recording device. She played several witness statements. Tourists who had been there described feeling scared and uncomfortable. One woman said her children had nightmares about the incident. A man said he was a veteran himself and was disgusted by Dan's behavior. Then Ms. Chen brought up Dan's social media history. She showed clips from his previous videos. The pattern of harassment and provocation. This wasn't an isolated incident, Your Honor. The defendant has a documented history of deliberately harassing people for online attention. This attack on the guard was simply the culmination of increasingly reckless behavior. Judge Williams watched everything carefully, taking notes, her expression unreadable. When the prosecution finished, Mr. Peterson stood to present Dan's defense. But what defense could he really offer? The video showed everything. There was no dispute about what happened. Your Honor, Mr. Peterson began, my client acknowledges his actions and deeply regrets them. This was a young man who made terrible choices in pursuit of social media attention. He understands now how serious his actions were, and how disrespectful he was to a serving member of the armed forces. Mr. Peterson explained Dan's background. No previous criminal record. Difficult few years trying to establish a career. Got caught up in social media culture, where extreme behavior gets rewarded with attention. Made increasingly poor decisions until this incident occurred. My client has lost his job, his social standing, and his reputation. He has been publicly vilified across the world. He understands that he brought this upon himself, but he has already suffered significant consequences even before this court proceeding. Then it was Dan's turn to speak. Mr. Peterson had coached him on what to say, but Dan's voice still shook as he stood. Your Honor, I want to say how sorry I am. What I did was stupid and disrespectful. I wasn't thinking about the guard as a real person doing an important job. I was only thinking about getting views and attention. I know that's not an excuse. I know I was wrong. Dan's voice cracked with emotion. I've had 2 weeks to think about what I did. I've seen how people view me now. I've lost friends, lost my job, lost respect for my family. But more importantly, I understand now that I disrespected someone who serves our country. That guard was just doing his duty and I attacked him for entertainment. I'm ashamed of who I became. He paused, wiping his eyes. The tears were real. If I could take it back, I would. I can't undo what I did, but I promise I've learned from this. I'll never do anything like this again. Judge Williams listened to everything without showing much emotion. When Dan sat down, she reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of her pen on paper. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Harrison, she began, and Dan felt his stomach drop. I've reviewed the evidence in this case, and I must say, it's one of the clearest cases of assault I've seen. The video evidence is indisputable. You deliberately harassed a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. You were given a clear warning to stop. And instead of backing away like any reasonable person would, you chose to escalate the situation and throw a punch. She paused, letting her words sink in. The Queen's Guard are not tourist attractions. They are not props for social media content. They are highly trained soldiers serving their country with pride and dedication. That young guard showed remarkable professionalism in dealing with you. He defended himself with appropriate force and then immediately returned to his duty. He did everything right. You did everything wrong. Dan's mom was quietly crying in the gallery behind him. However, Judge Williams continued, I do take into account that you have no previous criminal record. I also note that you have pleaded guilty, which at least shows some acceptance of responsibility. The question before me is what sentence appropriately reflects the severity of your offense, while also giving you an opportunity to learn from this experience. She reviewed some papers. The prosecution has requested a custodial sentence, and I must say I was seriously considering that option. Assault on a serviceman is a grave matter, but I'm going to give you one chance. Mr. Harrison, one chance to prove that you can become a better person. Dan felt a tiny flicker of hope. I'm sentencing you to 6 months imprisonment, suspended for 2 years. Do you understand what that means? Mr. Peterson leaned over and whispered, It means you won't go to prison right now, but if you commit any offense in the next 2 years, you'll serve the 6 months plus whatever new sentence you receive," Judge Williams continued. "In addition, you will perform 200 hours of community service. You will pay a fine of £2,000 to be paid within 6 months. You will pay compensation to the Ministry of Defense in the amount of £1,000. You will pay court costs and victim surcharge totaling another £2,000. That's a total of £5,000 in financial penalties." Dan's heart sank. £5,000. He didn't have that kind of money. Furthermore, the judge said, "You are banned from all royal properties for life. This includes Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and any other residence or property associated with the royal family. If you are found on any royal property, you will be arrested immediately and your suspended sentence will be activated. Finally, I'm ordering you to attend a rehabilitation program focused on social media addiction and responsible online behavior. The probation service will arrange this." Judge Williams looked directly at Dan. "Mr. Harrison, you threw away your reputation and nearly threw away your freedom for internet views. Let that be a lesson. Real life has real consequences." Part 8. Lessons Learned. 6 months had passed since that terrible day at Buckingham Palace. Dan stood in the community center where he had been doing his required service hours, mopping the floor of the main hall. This wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. And for the first time in years, Dan felt like he was actually doing something worthwhile. The community center served military veterans and their families. When the probation service first told Dan he would be working here, he had been terrified. Working with veterans after what he did to a serving soldier seemed like some kind of cruel punishment. But now, 6 months in, he understood why they had placed him here. This wasn't punishment. This was education. On his first day, Dan had been assigned to work with a man named George, a 70-year-old veteran who had served in the Royal Marines. George was in charge of facility maintenance and would be supervising Dan's community service hours. "So you're the lad who punched the Queen's Guard," George had said matter-of-factly on that first day. Dan had looked at his feet, ashamed. "Yes, sir." "Look at me when I'm talking to you," George had said, not unkindly but firmly. Dan had raised his eyes. "I'm not going to lecture you," George had continued. "I imagine you've had enough of that. But you're going to work here, alongside veterans helping this community, and maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something about service and respect. Now grab that mop. Those floors won't clean themselves." Over the following weeks and months, Dan worked alongside veterans from different branches of the military, different eras, different conflicts. There was Patricia, who had served as a nurse during the Falklands War. There was David, a former tank commander from the Iraq War. There was Ahmed, who had been injured by an IED in Afghanistan, and now volunteered at the center to help other veterans cope with their injuries. These weren't the faceless soldiers Dan had imagined. They were real people with families, stories, humor, and kindness. Patricia would bring homemade biscuits for everyone on Fridays. David loved terrible jokes and would crack them while they worked. Ahmed had lost his left leg but never complained, always staying positive and encouraging others. Dan listened to their stories as they worked together. He heard about the sacrifices they had made, the time away from their families, the danger they had faced, the friends they had lost. He learned about the pride they took in their service and the respect they had for the uniform they had worn. One day, about 3 months into his service, Dan was cleaning the windows of the center's main hall when 2 men walked in. One of them was wearing a red tunic. Dan's heart stopped. It was a Queen's Guard uniform, though the man wasn't in full ceremonial dress. The man saw Dan staring and smiled slightly. He walked over. "You're the lad from the video, aren't you?" he said. Dan nodded, feeling his face go hot with embarrassment. "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did." The guard extended his hand. "I'm Richard. I served with Tommy, the guard you attacked. We're from the same regiment." Dan hesitated, then shook his hand, expecting anger or hostility, but Richard's grip was firm and his expression was neutral. "Tommy's doing fine, by the way," Richard said, "still serving at the palace. That incident didn't affect him at all. He handled it professionally, exactly as he was trained to do. I'm glad he's okay," Dan said quietly. "I think about that day constantly, about how stupid I was, how disrespectful." Richard studied Dan for a moment. "George told me you've been working hard here." Showing up on time, doing good work, treating the veterans with respect. That's good. That's how you make amends. Not with words, but with actions. He paused, then continued. Look, we all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them. Tommy doesn't hold a grudge. He was just doing his job. But I hope you've learned that the uniform means something. The people who wear it have dedicated their lives to service. They deserve respect. I have learned that, Dan said earnestly. Being here, working with these veterans, hearing their stories. I understand now what I didn't understand before. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. Richard nodded. Good. Keep it that way. Then he walked away to join the other veterans for a meeting. That conversation stayed with Dan for weeks. The fact that Tommy harbored no ill will, that he had simply done his duty and moved on, made Dan feel both better and worse. Better because Tommy wasn't suffering. Worse because it highlighted how professional and mature Tommy had been compared to Dan's childish behavior. Dan's work at the center had also changed his perspective on social media. He saw veterans who had done genuinely heroic things, who had saved lives and served with distinction, and they weren't posting about it constantly or seeking attention. They were humble. They focused on helping others rather than promoting themselves. Meanwhile, Dan had spent 3 years desperately chasing attention for doing nothing meaningful at all. He had harassed people, caused trouble, and ultimately assaulted a soldier, all for views that meant nothing. What did those views get him? A criminal record, debt, and shame. Dan had deleted all his social media accounts. Not suspended them, deleted them entirely. He didn't want to be that person anymore. The person who saw everything through the lens of, will this get likes? He wanted to be someone who did things because they were right, not because they would get attention. His financial situation was still difficult. The £5,000 in fines and costs were being paid off slowly. He had found a job at a warehouse loading and unloading trucks. It was hard physical work early mornings and not glamorous. But it was honest employment, and his boss didn't care about his past as long as he showed up and did the work. Dan lived simply now. His tiny apartment, his warehouse job, his community service hours, and nothing else. No parties, no socializing, no attempts to rebuild his online presence. He kept his head down and focused on getting through each day. His relationship with his mom had slowly improved. She saw that he was genuinely trying to change. He visited her every Sunday for dinner, and they talked about real things, not internet fame or view counts. She told him she was proud that he was taking responsibility, even if it had taken a disaster to make him grow up. Most of his old friends hadn't come back, and Dan had accepted that. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt, but he had made a few new acquaintances at work and at the community center. People who knew his story but judged him on who he was now, not who he had been. One Saturday afternoon, Dan was at the community center organizing donated supplies when an elderly woman approached him. She introduced herself as the mother of a soldier currently serving overseas. George told me about you, she said, about what you did and about the work you've been doing here. Dan braced himself for criticism. I wanted to say thank you, she continued, surprising him. Thank you for learning from your mistake. Thank you for using your time here to help veterans instead of just going through the motions. My son is a soldier, and it means something to me that you've come to understand what that uniform represents. Dan felt tears prick his eyes. Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know. She patted his arm and walked away, leaving Dan standing there feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine pride in himself. Not pride from getting views or likes, but pride from knowing he had done something good without any expectation of recognition or reward. By the time Dan completed his 200 hours of community service, he had become a familiar and valued presence at the center. George pulled him aside on his last official day. You've done good work here, lad, George said. You came in as someone who needed to learn a lesson, and you're leaving as someone who actually learned it. I'm proud of you. Thank you, George, for everything. For giving me a chance, for treating me with respect even when I didn't deserve it. George smiled. We all deserve a second chance. It's what we do with it that matters. So what's next for you? I've been thinking about that, Dan said. The warehouse job pays the bills, but I want to do something more. I've applied to a program that trains people to work with at-risk youth, kids who are heading down the wrong path. I thought maybe I could help them avoid the mistakes I made. That's a fine idea, George nodded approvingly. You've got a story to tell and it might help someone else avoid your fate. Dan smiled. I hope so. I can't change what I did, but maybe I can stop someone else from making the same stupid choices. On his way home that evening, Dan walked past a newsstand. There was a magazine with a cover story about social media influencers, young people who had become famous and wealthy through online content. 6 months ago, Dan would have stared at that magazine with envy and longing. Now he just walked past without a second glance. Fame wasn't what he wanted anymore. Respect was what mattered. Self-respect? Earned through doing the right thing even when nobody was watching. Respect from people like George and Richard and the veterans at the center. Respect from his mom, and maybe eventually respect from himself. That night, Dan sat in his small apartment and did something he had been avoiding for months. He wrote a genuine apology letter. Not for social media, not for views, but a private letter to Tommy, the guard he had attacked. He didn't expect a response. He didn't expect forgiveness. He just needed to say, in his own words without cameras or audience, how sorry he was.